on the morning of October 24, 1944. Somewhere in the green-blue waters of the Sibuyan Sea, in the heart of the Philippine archipelago, the largest and most powerfully armed battleship the Imperial Japanese Navy had ever put to sea was dying. Not quickly, not mercifully, but slowly, terribly, and with the kind of agonizing finality that only comes when something believed to be invincible is finally forced to reckon with its own destruction. The Musashi, a ship so vast, so heavily armored, so bristling with the most fearsome naval guns ever mounted on a warship, was taking on water through wounds torn open by American aircraft she was never supposed to fear. Her crew of over 2,000 men felt the tilt beneath their boots. They heard the deep, metallic groan of steel under pressure it was never designed to bear. And somewhere amid the smoke and fire and chaos, officers who had once stood on her bridge with absolute confidence in her indestructibility were beginning to understand that they had been catastrophically wrong. How does a ship like that die? How does a vessel displacing over 70,000 tons of water at full load, armored with steel belts nearly 16 inches thick, capable of hurling shells the size of compact automobiles over 25 miles, simply cease to exist in a single afternoon? How does the pride of an empire, the physical embodiment of Japanese naval supremacy, vanish beneath 300 meters of water so completely that it would take over 70 years and one of the most advanced deep-sea search expeditions in history to even find her again? These are not rhetorical flourishes. These are genuine, unsettling questions, questions that cut to the heart of what happened in the Sibuyan Sea on that October morning, and what the loss of the Musashi truly meant for the arc of the Second World War in the Pacific. Because here is the thing that history books sometimes fail to convey about the Musashi. Her destruction was not simply a military defeat. It was the unraveling of an entire strategic philosophy, a philosophy that had consumed years, fortunes, and thousands of lives in its construction. When she slipped beneath the surface just after 1900 hours on October 24th, she took with her not only the hopes of her crew, but the last credible dream of Japanese naval dominance in the Pacific. The battleship age did not end abstractly in a conference room or a strategic review. It ended in the Sibuyan Sea, in fire and flooding and the screaming of metal, as American dive bombers and torpedo planes rewrote the future with devastating precision. What you are about to hear is the full story of how she was built, why she mattered, what she was sent to do, and how she was lost, and why, even now, the Musashi refuses to be forgotten. To understand why the loss of the Musashi struck the Imperial Japanese Navy like a blade to the throat, you have to understand the world from which she emerged, a world defined by naval treaties, national pride wounded to its core, and a strategic vision that placed the battleship at the absolute center of Japanese maritime power. The story begins not in the Pacific, but in the conference rooms of Washington and London in the early 1920s, where the great naval powers of the world sat down and agreed, more or less, to limit the size and number of their capital ships. For Japan, a rising power acutely sensitive to any suggestion that it was being treated as lesser than Britain or the United States, the Washington Naval Treaty of 1922 and the subsequent London Treaty of 1930 were not merely diplomatic agreements, they were humiliations, numerical ceilings that codified informal international law. The idea that Japan should have a smaller navy than the Western powers it was increasingly determined to challenge. The Japanese naval establishment did not accept this quietly. In the secrecy of their planning rooms and design bureaus, officers and engineers began asking a question that would define the next decade of their shipbuilding program. If we cannot have more ships than the Americans, what if we simply built ships so vastly superior in firepower and protection that numbers would cease to matter? What if a single Japanese battleship could destroy any two American battleships it encountered? This was the seed of what became the Yamato class, a class of warships so ambitious in its specifications, so extreme in its design parameters that it represented one of the most audacious engineering undertakings of the 20th century, in peacetime or war. The program was wrapped in extraordinary secrecy from the beginning. Japanese naval planners were acutely aware that the Western powers, if they learned of what was being designed, would simply build larger ships themselves and nullify the entire strategic advantage. Accordingly, the construction of the Yamato class was classified at the highest possible level. Workers at the Korai Naval Arsenal, where the lead ship Yamato was laid down in November 1937, were compartmentalized. They knew only their own specific task, never the whole. The dry docks were covered with elaborate netting and screening to prevent aerial observation. Civilians who lived near the shipyards were quietly discouraged from looking too closely at what was being assembled behind those barriers. The ships that would eventually emerge from this secrecy were, by any measure, extraordinary. The Musashi herself was laid down at the Mitsubishi shipyard in Nagasaki on March 29, 1938. Her keel plates lowered into position with the kind of ceremony that attended the birth of something the Imperial Navy considered almost sacred. She was a Yamato-class battleship, one of only two ever completed, the other being her sister ship Yamato, and her specifications read less like engineering data and more like a declaration of war against the very concept of limits. At full load displacement, she weighed approximately 72,800 tons, making her and Yamato the heaviest battleships ever constructed in human history, a record that stands to this day. Her length stretched to 263 meters, nearly 900 feet of riveted, welded, and forged steel. Her beam measured 38.9 meters at the waterline. She required a crew of over 2,400 men to operate a small city unto herself, floating on the surface of the sea. Her main armament was the defining characteristic of her class, 9 Type 94 46 cm. Naval guns arranged in 3 triple turrets, 2 forward and 1 aft. These were the largest naval guns ever mounted on a warship, capable of firing a 1,460-kilogram armor-piercing shell to a maximum range of approximately 42 kilometers. To put that in some human perspective, each shell she fired weighed more than a modern automobile, and she could send 9 of them through the air simultaneously over a distance that would span the width of many entire cities. Her secondary battery of 6 155mm guns, her anti-aircraft suite, and the dense honeycomb of her internal armor and torpedo protection, all of it spoke to a ship designed not merely to fight, but to dominate every surface engagement she entered. Her main armor belt ran 410 millimeters thick. Her turret faces were armored to 650 millimeters. She was, by every conventional measure of naval architecture and weapons technology available in 1944, impregnable to surface attack. But conventional measures were already becoming obsolete, and the Japanese naval planners who had conceived the Yamato class had made their central calculation in a world that was already disappearing beneath their feet, even as the ships were being built. The rise of carrier aviation, the demonstrated power of aircraft to deliver lethal strikes against surface ships from distances far beyond any gun range. These realities had been reshaping naval warfare since the early years of the conflict. The attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941 had been a carrier operation, not a battleship engagement. The Battle of Midway in June 1942, which broke the back of Japanese carrier aviation and changed the entire trajectory of the Pacific War, had been decided entirely in the air by aircraft launched from ships that barely fired their guns the entire battle. The battleship, even a battleship as extraordinary as the Musashi, was beginning to look like the most expensive answer to a question nobody was asking anymore. The Musashi was commissioned into the Imperial Japanese Navy on August 5, 1942, a date that placed her operational life squarely in the middle of a war that was already beginning to turn against Japan. Her first commanding officer was Rear Admiral Kaoru Arima. She spent her early operational career at Truk Lagoon, the massive Japanese naval base in the Caroline. islands that served as the forward operating hub for Imperial naval forces in the Central and Western Pacific. Her role during this period was largely that of a flagship, a symbol of power and prestige rather than a combatant actively engaged in the kind of fleet-to-fleet surface actions she had been designed to fight. Those surface actions never materialized. The Americans, after Midway, were not going to give the Japanese Navy the decisive fleet engagement it craved. It's the kind of Mahanian clash of battle line against battle line that Japanese naval strategy had been premised upon for decades. Instead, the war in the Pacific ground on through island-hopping campaigns, aerial battles, and submarine warfare, contexts in which the Musashi's 9 magnificent guns were largely irrelevant. She was not entirely inactive. In April 1943, while transiting toward Truk, the Musashi was struck by a torpedo fired from the American submarine USS Tunney, one of the early reminders that even the most heavily protected surface ship was vulnerable to weapons delivered from beneath the waves. The torpedo struck her bow, killing 11 men and causing significant flooding. But the Musashi's damage control systems, exhaustively designed and practiced, contained the flooding, and she returned to Truk under her own power. It was a warning that seems, in retrospect, to have carried more prophetic weight than anyone in the Japanese Naval Command was prepared to acknowledge. She survived that encounter because her torpedo protection system performed as designed. But the message embedded in that explosion, that aircraft and submarines were the true arbiters of power in this new kind of war, went either unheeded or enacted upon in any meaningful strategic sense. By October 1944, the strategic situation facing Japan had deteriorated to a point that bordered on the catastrophic SCU. American forces under General Douglas MacArthur had returned to the Philippines, landing at Leyte Gulf on October 20th and setting in motion one of the largest and most complex naval engagements in history. For Japan, the Philippines were not simply territory. They were the linchpin of the entire southern resource zone, the network of sea lanes through which oil from Borneo and the Dutch East Indies flowed north to fuel Japanese industry and the Japanese war machine. If the Americans secured the Philippines, those sea lanes would be severed. Japan's warships would have fuel for one final engagement, and then they would be floating monuments to a lost cause. The Philippines had to be held, or the war was effectively over. Into this existential crisis, the Japanese Naval Command launched Shogo Operation Victory, one of the most ambitious and desperate naval plans ever conceived. It involved multiple task forces converging on Leyte Gulf from different directions, attempting to catch the American invasion fleet in a coordinated pincer that would allow Japanese surface ships to annihilate the transports and supply vessels before they could unload their cargo of troops and equipment. The central element of this plan was the 1st Striking Force, also known as Force A, commanded by Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita, a veteran fleet commander who had been at the center of Japanese naval operations throughout the Pacific War. Kurita flew his flag aboard the heavy cruiser Atago. But the most powerful component of his force was the Battleship Division that included both Yamato and Musashi, the two great sisters of the Yamato class, finally being sent into combat together for what would prove to be the only time. The Musashi at this point was under the command of Rear Admiral Inoguchi Toshihei, a capable and experienced officer who understood both the capabilities and the limitations of the ship he commanded. His crew numbered approximately 2,400 men: sailors, gunners, engineers, damage control parties, anti-aircraft crews, men who had trained extensively and who, despite the darkening fortunes of the war, maintained the discipline and professionalism that characterized the Imperial Japanese Navy's surface forces throughout the conflict. Many of them were veterans. Many of them knew, in that particular way that fighting men develop a sense for these things, that the operation they were embarking upon was not the kind from which one could reasonably expect to return. Force sortied from Linga Roads, near Singapore, on October 18, 1944. They transited through the Palawan Passage, where American submarines were already waiting, sinking the heavy cruisers at Tago and Maya, and damaging the Taco before Kurita's force even reached the Philippines proper. Kurita himself was briefly in the water after the Otago went down, rescued and transferred to the Yamato, from which he continued to command. The force pressed on, entering the Sibuyan Sea on the morning of October 24th. The Sibuyan Sea is an enclosed body of water in the heart of the Philippine archipelago, ringed by islands, relatively shallow in places, and, critically, within range of American carrier-based aircraft operating from the escort and fleet carriers supporting the Leyte landings. There was no air cover for Kurita's force. Japanese land-based air power in the Philippines had been devastated in the weeks of fighting that preceded the landings. The carriers of the mobile fleet were being used as decoys to the north, drawing away Admiral Halsey's powerful Third Fleet. Force A would have to cross the Sibuyan Sea exposed, unprotected from above, relying on its anti-aircraft batteries and its speed and its armor to survive. For a conventional surface warship in 1944, against American naval air power, those were increasingly inadequate defenses. For the Musashi, even the Musashi, they would prove to be not nearly enough. What happened next would unfold over the course of a single devastating day. In 5 separate waves of American aircraft from the carriers of Task Force 38. Each wave finding the great battleship and delivering its ordnance with the terrible efficiency of men who had been fighting and refining their tactics for years. The Musashi would be struck by an estimated 19 torpedoes and 17 bombs, numbers that remain somewhat uncertain given the chaos of the engagement, but numbers that speak to an assault of almost incomprehensible ferocity. Sailors would fight fires in magazine spaces while the ship listed beneath them. Damage control teams would shore up flooding compartments while new explosions tore open adjacent ones. Inoguchi would give the order to flood counter-flooding tanks to correct the list, buying time, slowing the inevitable. The 9 great guns would fire back at the aircraft, reduced, ultimately, to firing special Sanjikidan anti-aircraft shells. And the concussion of those guns firing at aircraft targets was so violent it blew men off their feet on the deck below. All of it was extraordinary. None of it was enough. By the time the sun began its descent toward the western horizon on October 24, 1944, the Musashi was past saving, and the 2,000 men still aboard her were beginning to understand what that meant.